Crystal clear waters, endless beaches, impassable jungles, landscapes that take us to the very heart of what the word paradise means. My friends, this is the Philippines, a remote and little known country that has nevertheless had a significant historical connection with both Spain and somehow with many of Latin America's Hispanic countries as well.
La legendaria galantería hispana ha rebasado sus límites, dando al mundo la más hermosa lección de diplomacia porque toca al corazón.
This former Spanish colony in Southeast Asia was, for more than 3 centuries, part of the Spanish Empire. Then, after the defeat of Spanish troops in 1898 by those of the United States, the Philippines were sold to the US for $20 million. With adjustments for inflation, that works out to about $620 million in today's money. And yes, at that time, the colonies were sold as if they were plots of beachfront land. Of course, in this case, the sale and price were practically determined by the United States. After all, they had just won the war and they had the biggest guns. Of course, far from gaining independence, or at least improving its independence, with the United States leading the way, freedom for Filipinos, ironically, did not come. After being sold to the Americans, the Philippines was governed by the US for nearly 5 decades, until, finally, in 1946, they gained their actual independence. Since then, the trajectory of this country has not exactly been a bed of roses, but rather, it's been a bunch of thorns. Dictatorships, corruption, violence, drug trafficking, Islamism, the Philippines manages to bring together a bit of all of the worst problems that lurk in countries as far away as Venezuela, Honduras, and Pakistan. And to combat this, now they have Duterte. Rodrigo Duterte is currently the Philippine president, and despite being democratically elected, let's just say there's little to no sign of democracy. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite. Check it out.
Philippine mayor on Duterte narco list shot dead. The Straits Times. A slaughter them policy that targets the Philippines poor. Al Jazeera. President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs policy has led to more than 20,000 deaths since 2016.
Okay, so we are talking about full-blown extrajudicial executions. In fact, the Philippine government has actually legalized them. So, do you want to know more about this faraway country? Do you want to know more about the dark figure of Rodrigo Duterte? So, if you do, and why wouldn't you, listen up.
The Philippines, a country of the best and worst.
First off, this is about to get pretty heavy, so I think to start off with, it would be a good idea to get to know the country we're talking about a little better. And I have to tell you that we're talking about a very unusual country. On one hand, we're talking about the first country in all of Asia to have a constitution approved by a partially elected Congress, so a good thing. That happened all the way back in the late 19th century. In the short period between the end of Spanish rule and the US invasion, there was a short-lived, unrecognized republic known internationally as the Republic of Malosos. But of course, after paying $20 million for these islands, the Americans were very clear that this territory belonged to them. So they had no qualms about using all the force necessary to end the self-proclaimed republic. In the sort of ironic twist that only history can give us, any support for the independence cause was considered a criminal activity by the US. And in 1906, American troops arrested and executed members of the last government of the republic, including its president, General Macario Sakay.
Death will come to us all sooner or later, so I will stand calmly before the Lord Almighty. But I want to tell you that we are not bandits or thieves, as the Americans have accused us, but members of the revolutionary force that defended our motherland, the Philippines. Long live democracy, and hopefully our independence will be reborn in the future. Long live the Philippines. Macario Sakay.
So, the Philippines is an extremely diverse country. To give you an idea, its 110 million inhabitants speak 170 different languages. That is a bigger mess than my teeth. And yet, that's not its biggest problem. Not by a long shot. Despite the fact that, up until the coronavirus crisis, this country had gone 20 years without suffering a single quarter of negative growth. And even though over the last decade the average economic growth has been almost 6% per year, the Philippines remains a very poor country. A country where the majority of the population remains anchored in absolute poverty. This is a country where the average salary is just over $200 per month, and where one of the main sources of wealth is the nearly $30 billion that more than 12 million Filipinos around the world transfer in remittances to their families each year. And if we consider the problems that the government has controlling a country made up of more than 7,000 islands, poor infrastructure, and 170 different languages, then we find it is the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of non-recommended activities. So, my visual polygeeks, poverty and lack of control by the government and the legal system over a large part of the country has made the Philippines one of the biggest Asian epicenters for human trafficking and also for drug trafficking. The Philippines is not only the largest consumer of methamphetamines and marijuana in Eastern Asia, but also its largest producer. And do you know where most of the cartels operating in the country come from? They come from China. And you can get an idea of what this might entail. As in other countries where these mafias exist, violence and lack of security are a huge problem. Around all of these narcotic mafias, a whole web of illegal economies have also been created, dedicated to the trafficking of people, organs, smuggling of all kinds, and practically any other criminal activity that you can think of. Of course, going hand in hand with this, corruption is almost institutionalized as one more economic stream. And, as you can probably imagine, poverty has forced many families to have to throw themselves into the arms of one of the many underworld groups operating in the country. And it is against this backdrop, as we shall see, that the figure of Duterte arises. A president basically characterized by two things: a heavy hand, as in a very hard line against crime, and promises of economic growth. For the latter, he means to clear the deck and switch strategic partners. You see, for many years, the Philippines had been very close to the United States, obviously. So much so that Washington has come to classify its relationship with the Philippines as special. And the nation is considered one of its most important strategic allies in Asia, along with countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, or Thailand. However, since President Duterte's arrival in 2016, the Manila-Washington axis has been increasingly veering to Beijing, especially over the past 2 years. Look, and you can see what change there has been.
May 2017, Duterte says China's sea threatened war if Philippines drills for oil. Reuters. April 2018, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte says he needs China, quote, loves Xi Jinping. CNN. I need China. More than anybody else at this point, I need China. I simply love Xi Jinping. He understood. He understands my problem and is willing to help. So I would say, thank you, China. Rodrigo Duterte, President of the Philippines.
Above all else, Duterte wants money, investment, and as much Chinese capital as possible to lift the country's economy. He couldn't be more transparent about it. Check this out.
Our destiny lies in Asia, not in the Middle East, as they're too busy fighting and they don't have any money. And if you don't have money, you're not my friend. So I go to China. Plenty of money. President Duterte.
Are you kind of surprised at such sincerity? Because honestly, you probably shouldn't be. Duterte is anything but a normal president. And, in a way, it is quite logical that he should get along better with dictators like Xi Jinping than with the leaders of Western democracies. So, what's the reason? Well, listen up.
Duterte, the toughest president.
If anything has characterized Rodrigo Duterte since the beginning of his presidency, it is that he is a president who speaks plainly and who does not mess around. Let's just say that if we were talking about scruples, he has absolutely none. He is willing to do whatever it takes to fight not only drug trafficking and criminals, but also his own political adversaries. In fact, his harsh ways have earned him fame around the world for being a dictator and a tyrant and for not respecting even the most basic of human rights. Take, for example, what happened during the SARS-CoV-2 crisis. Duterte promised to enforce quarantines completely at any cost. Listen up.
Duterte's response to the coronavirus. Shoot them dead. Foreign policy. My orders to the police and military. If there is trouble or the situation arises where your life is on the line, shoot them dead. Understand? Dead. I'll send you to the grave. Don't test the government. Rodrigo Duterte.
So, 2 days after these statements, a 63-year-old farmer was shot by police for not wearing a mask. According to the agents, the man threatened them with a scythe? Proportionality? What the hell is that? Anyway, in this environment, there has been an increase in shootings of civilians by police across the country, something that is not covered up at all by law enforcement.
Anyone out at the wrong time will be shot, you sons of Philippine police officer, in a radio report.
And that is not all. Following the government's own orders in some municipalities, people who were caught skipping curfews have been locked in dog cages. In other places, punishments have also been applied that could easily be mistaken for torture. Of course, this kind of thing didn't start with the coronavirus. Duterte is a guy who simply does not believe in reintegration. According to him, as he has expressed many times, those who commit crimes are nothing more than expendable social waste. That is precisely why Duterte established a zero-tolerance policy against drug traffickers and narcotics consumers. Since his arrival in power, he has also ordered a shoot-to-kill policy. And look, consider this for just one moment. Despite all of this being a clear violation of the most basic human rights, what the Philippines has experienced tells us that this tough approach is not the best way to fight crime. And what Duterte has done is simply to set in motion a whole machinery of extrajudicial executions. It has given the police, many public officials, and their own government the ability to get rid of people with total impunity. And this is in a country with very high levels of corruption and despotism. Let me ask you a simple question. Would you dare, in an environment like this, oppose the government or denounce the wheelings and dealings of, for example, a corrupt police officer? I bet that you wouldn't. You see, since the first zero-tolerance policy was launched, or perhaps we should call that the zero-legality policy, at least 6,600 people are estimated to have lost their lives in the Philippines, according to the police. However, that number, according to Human Rights Watch, goes all the way up to 27,000 people. To top it all off, many of those people had nothing to do with drug trafficking or mafias or any criminal activity at all, but they were simply people who were caught in the crossfire or corruption or for some other reason. So, at this point, how do you think that Philippine residents rate their president? Well, contrary to what you might think, Rodrigo Duterte's popularity is around 80. That's right, 80%. It is a little bit less than complete fervor, but how on earth can a guy like that achieve these levels of approval? Well, it may seem hard to accept in our culture, but in a nation hit by crime, narcotics, trafficking, human trafficking, and poverty, it's no wonder that for many people, things like freedom and human rights are left far in the background. Indeed, according to polls, only 15% of residents consider democracy to be essential. And even for us in the West, some of this might be starting to sound creepily familiar. In the end, what we have already seen happen many other times happens. Despair, disappointment, and corruption are often the best ways to feed authoritarian leaders. Anyway, it's your turn now. Is a president like Duterte entitled to pass on human rights even if he pursues an end that theoretically could be good? Is the fight against crime more important than law and justice? Do you think you would like someone like Duterte in your country? Before I say to you about the comments, this has been a pretty heavy video, so why don't you give your pet a little pat, give your mum a hug, and get yourself a nice cup of tea so that we can all feel better. Anyway, leave your comments here below, and if you like this video, do not forget to give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and you can keep yourself up to date with everything that is to come by clicking on the little alarm button down there. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.